Let me start with a number: $8 trillion. That is how much money the Federal Reserve created between January 2020 and April 2022. Not borrowed, not taxed. Created, typed into existence on a computer screen in Washington, D.C. $8 trillion in 26 months. To put that in perspective, it took the United States over 200 years, from 1776 to 2008, to accumulate its first $8 trillion in national debt. The Fed printed the equivalent of 2 centuries of government spending in just over 2 years. And here is what happened immediately after. The stock market more than doubled. Real estate prices rose 34% nationwide. Billionaire wealth increased by $1.3 trillion in just the first 6 months of the pandemic alone. Meanwhile, real wages fell. Inflation hit 9.1%, the highest in 40 years. Grocery prices rose over 11%. Rent increased by double digits in most major cities. First-time homebuyers were priced out of the market permanently in most of the country. This was not an accident. This was not a policy mistake. This was the system working exactly as it was designed to work. And the reason almost nobody understands why is because the mechanism that drives it, the actual engine of this wealth transfer, is never explained to the people it affects most. By the end of this video, you will understand that mechanism. And more importantly, you will understand exactly what to do about it. Most people learn in school that the Federal Reserve is an independent government agency that manages monetary policy to keep inflation low and employment high. That description is technically accurate and almost entirely misleading about what the Fed actually is and how it actually operates in practice. The real story begins in November 1910. A group of men gathered in secret at Jekyll Island, a private resort off the coast of Georgia, under the cover of a duck hunting trip. The actual attendees included Senator Nelson Aldrich, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and chairman of the National Monetary Commission, Frank Vanderlip, the president of the Rockefeller-controlled National City Bank, Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg, representing the Rothschild banking dynasty in Europe, and Benjamin Strong, who would become the first head of the New York Federal Reserve. These men spent 9 days drafting the blueprint for what became the Federal Reserve System. Together, they represented approximately 1/4 of the entire wealth of the world at that time. The institution they designed is privately owned by member commercial banks. The presidents of the regional Federal Reserve banks, including the New York Fed, which holds a permanent voting seat on the most powerful monetary committee on earth, are not appointed by elected officials. They are selected by boards dominated by commercial banking interests. The revolving door between senior Fed positions and firms like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and BlackRock is not an exception. It is the norm. This does not make the Fed corrupt in the traditional sense. It means the Fed is staffed by people whose entire professional framework centers on the stability of the financial system. The interests of wage earners and savers are not absent from their thinking. They are simply not the primary lens. Now let me explain the single most important economic concept you will ever learn for understanding how wealth actually moves in this country. It is called the Cantillon Effect, and it was identified by an economist named Richard Cantillon in the early 18th century. His observation was this: when new money enters an economy, it does not distribute itself evenly. It enters at a specific point, benefits the people closest to that entry point first, and only gradually and incompletely reaches the broader population. By the time the new money has spread through the economy, prices have already risen to reflect the increased money supply. But the people who receive the new money first spend it at the old, lower prices. The people who received it last, or not at all, now face higher prices with the same income they had before. In the 21st century, the mechanism works like this. When the Federal Reserve conducts quantitative easing, it purchases treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities directly from large banks and asset managers. Those institutions receive cash. They deploy that cash into stocks, corporate bonds, and real estate. Asset prices rise. According to the Federal Reserve's own survey of consumer finances, the bottom 50% of Americans own approximately 1% of all financial assets. The top 10% own approximately 87%. When the Fed inflates asset prices, 87% of the benefit flows to the top 10%. 1% reaches the bottom half. This is not a characterization. This is the Fed's own data. The numbers from the actual QE programs confirm this precisely. Between 2008 and 2014, the Fed created $3.6 trillion. During that same period, the S&P 500 roughly tripled. The net worth of the top 1% increased by approximately $3 trillion. Real median household income in 2014 was lower than it had been in 2008. The Fed created trillions, the wealthy got enormously richer, and the median household ended the period poorer in inflation-adjusted terms than when it started. Then in 2020, they did it again, but on a scale that dwarfed everything before. Nearly $5 trillion in approximately 2 years. The stock market more than doubled. Real estate rose 34%. Billionaire wealth surged. And then came the consequence that was mathematically inevitable. Inflation at 9.1%, the highest in 40 years, which hit people without assets with devastating force, while people with assets simply watched their holdings appreciate in nominal value. This brings us to a concept called financial repression, and it is one of the most powerful tools in the government's economic arsenal. Financial repression occurs when interest rates are deliberately kept below the inflation rate, meaning savers receive returns on their deposits that are consistently negative in real terms. Your money sits in a savings account. The number on the statement does not change, but every year it buys less, permanently, without any legislation, without any politician casting a vote. Wealth flows silently from savers to borrowers, and in a government context, from citizens to the government itself, which is the primary beneficiary of the inflation tax on its outstanding debt. This is not a new phenomenon. After World War II, the United States carried a debt-to-GDP ratio comparable to today's levels. Over the following 35 years, that ratio fell from approximately 120% to under 30%, not primarily through fiscal discipline, but through sustained financial repression. Savers and fixed-income investors bore the cost. Asset owners saw their holdings appreciate. An IMF working paper by Carmen Reinhart and M. Belen-Sprancia calculated that financial repression cost fixed-income holders approximately 1 to 2% of GDP per year during that period. Compounded over 3.5 decades, the total wealth transfer was in the tens of trillions of dollars. And the same paper, published in 2011, explicitly noted that the conditions for a new period of financial repression were already present. It was written by IMF economists. It was not a conspiracy theory. It was empirical analysis and a prediction. What came was exactly what the paper predicted. The Federal Reserve operates under an official dual mandate: maximum employment and price stability. But the operational reality, visible in 40 years of actual behavior, is that the Fed has a third priority that supersedes both when they conflict with it: financial stability, meaning the prevention of significant declines in asset prices. In 2018, the Fed was raising rates. The labor market was at full employment. Inflation was at target. Both elements of the official mandate were being met. Then the stock market fell 20% in the fourth quarter. In January 2019, the Fed reversed course completely, stopped raising rates, stopped shrinking its balance sheet, with no change in employment or inflation data to justify it. Asset prices required a reversal. The Fed responded to asset prices. This pattern has repeated consistently. When markets fall, the Fed intervenes. When banks face losses, the Fed intervenes. When the financial system experiences stress, the Fed creates money. The dual mandate is the public story. Financial stability, which in practice means asset price support, is the operational priority. And every intervention follows the same Cantillon pathway. New money flows to asset owners first, inflates their wealth, and reaches wage earners only later as higher prices on everything they need to buy. So what do you actually do with this understanding in 2026? The current environment presents a specific and finite window. Interest rates are higher than they have been in 2 decades. A 1-year Treasury bill paying around 4 to 5% in an environment where inflation is running near 3% is a genuine real return. The first time savers have had access to that since 2008. That window will not stay open. The Fed will cut rates again. It always does. Lock in these rates now before the next accommodation cycle begins. At the same time, be positioned in real assets before that cycle arrives, not after. Own equities, particularly through broad index funds. Own real estate if you can. Use fixed-rate debt to acquire appreciating assets if the numbers make sense. The next round of quantitative easing, whenever it comes, will inflate those assets. You want to own them on the way up, not be trying to buy them after the Cantillon Effect has already done its work and priced you out. Diversify internationally. U.S. equities trade at historically high valuations by most measures. International markets trade at substantially lower valuations and offer better margin of safety at current prices. A globally diversified portfolio captures the next accommodation cycle regardless of where it inflates first, and understand the psychology of what you are up against. The most consistent finding in behavioral economics is that people underestimate slow-moving risks and overreact to fast-moving ones. A stock market crash demands an immediate response. A 3% annual erosion of purchasing power that happens invisibly over 20 years barely registers, until the retirement that was supposed to be comfortable suddenly looks precarious, until the house that was within reach has doubled in price, until the savings account has lost a third of its real value and the compounding has been working against you for a decade. The people I most want to reach with this video are not the wealthy. They already understand the Cantillon Effect, even if they do not use that name. They are positioned correctly. I want to reach the person in their 30s, saving diligently in a savings account and calling it responsible. I want to reach the person in their 40s who has been meaning to start investing, but keeps waiting for the right moment. I want to reach the person in their 50s who has worked hard their entire life and cannot understand why they feel financially behind, despite doing everything society told them to do. You are not behind because you made mistakes. You are behind because the rules of the game were never explained to you clearly. The game is designed so that the people who understand the mechanism benefit from it, and the people who do not subsidize the ones who do. You now understand the mechanism. The system will keep running exactly as it has. The only variable is where you choose to stand in relation to it.